Okay, class. Again, I apologize. I know the video cut off, but this is a continuation of part 2, so we're going to call this part 3. And what I was getting into at the time was I was talking about the ways that you can manipulate the intensity of the drills as far as the different types of jumps. So I kind of mentioned this Henneman size principle and the different categorization of exercises as far as what's the most neurologically demanding. Well, this jumps basically like line right here is an explanation of that, right? It's a variation of that. Most charts you see will include different types of barbell lifts, Olympic lifts. They'll also include sprinting in there as well. So one thing I want you to do before we start is I want you to put sprinting at the end of this. That's the truest, most form of plyometric that you can get. It reaches the fastest speeds that the body is capable of, and you get some of the highest forces per step that you will get according to any other plyometric. So if we're to look at this wave, we have jumps in place, which would be like a vertical jump. We have standing jumps, which means a singular broad jump, right? Jumping out for distance. Once we start adding in multiple jumps in a row, that's when the plyometric starts to get a little bit more intense. So one way we could progress is going from a single or a vertical jump in place to 4 vertical jumps in place, or a broad jump out or multiple broad jumps out. That adding of multiple jumps will make the plyometric drill more intense, giving you a better plyometric effect if applied at the right time. After the multiple jumps, you have bounds, and bounds are essentially a type of sprinting drill to work on force application into the ground. Now, when you're talking about bounds, essentially the way I like to coach them, not on a very high level, I coach it as I want you to run from point A to B, but I want you to take the biggest steps possible. So essentially it's like a truer form of jumping from leg to work on applying force to the ground, a lot more force to the ground per step quickly. Then we have box drills. This means any types of box jump. Box jumps are good because you can add a decent amount of weight to them or change the variation of them. You kind of don't have to worry about as much of a loading factor. That's another kind of topic for the day, but box drills, especially jumping off of boxes. So if you're talking about jumping off of boxes, that's a lot more intense than jumping onto the box because you have to land, right? Especially if you have added weight. Lastly, depth jump. So depth jump is the second purest form of plyometric. And what a depth jump is when you're on one height of a box, you drop off of that and jump up onto a higher height. Okay, so when you're at a moderate height, you jump to a high height. That would be a depth jump. That's one of the truest forms of plyometrics, and it's a very useful tool, especially if you're going to pair with some sort of explosive type of lifting, like Olympic lifting or dynamic effort type lifting. Now, when we look at training considerations, we have a frequency. It says typically 1 to 3 sessions a week, or 2 to 4 depending on the competition season. Now, it's important to understand where that's coming from, because if you can't just think about the plyometric actions that you are going to prescribe somebody, you have to account for all the plyometric actions that's going to be taking place during practice, during the sport itself. So one of those sessions could be the actual sport or practice of that sport itself, where you count that session, or even a game. So you would want to consider games as training, right? They're going to be inherently more intense because it is the game, right? There's something different about being in that environment of the actual competition that you can't replicate. You can get as close to it as you want, but you will not replicate it. So you have to account for that almost as a session. So depending on where an athlete's at least one time a week, probably earlier on in the off season, in like hypertrophy type cycles, your body's not going to be completely ready or able to handle some of the intensities and the speeds because of the breakdown of the muscle that's occurring in hypertrophy type of work. So you're going to want to limit that to 1 to 2 times per week. I will say, depending on the sport and position, some that can vary even within the sport. So, for example, a lineman's not going to have to worry about plyometric action as much as a skill player. That does not mean that linemen don't worry about it at all. That's actually one of the determining factors between if a lineman is going to be elite or not, is how fast they are, how well they can move, but they also have to produce a lot of power, right? They have to be well versed in plyometrics and power output within the context of their position, okay? So the recovery is dependent on the intensity of the drill. So between sessions, you're looking at 48 to 72 hours. That's a little, you can find other ways to get around that 48 to 72 hours, but the most intense things you're not going to be able to do as consistently. That's what you need to get from that. Now, with volume, this is very good for extensive plyometrics as compared to intensive. So most of the plyometric actions that we're thinking about and talking of are the really intense things like sprinting, depth jumps, vertical jumps for height, broad jumps for distance, right? Those are the intensive type of plyometrics where you're really looking at outputs. This volume is not realistic for that, especially if you're talking about depth jumps, right? If we're looking at depth jumps and we say, okay, somebody who's advanced should do 120 to 140 contacts. Well, you only have one contact per depth jump, so that means that you need to do at least 120 reps. We need to be careful with that, and that's why this volume guideline is really good for extensive plyometrics, which is essentially the hypertrophy of plyometric work, right? It's the tendon, ligament, joint building of, it's the precursor work to intensive. Right, it's just like when before you move heavy weights, you want to get accustomed to the movement and build some muscle mass to be able to produce the force on that neurological level. It's the same type of concept. So understand this chart as far as beginner, intermediate, and advanced, but just know that this really shouldn't apply to intensive work. Now, I apologize that this video was broken up to so many parts. I hope it's not that confusing. I tried to follow along just as smoothly as I could. Big things that you need to know from part 1, you need to know the mechanical and neurological model of the plyo. Part 2, we're looking that you need to know the 4 ways to manipulate the intensity of a drill. Other than that, go ahead and move to the next lecture.